Okay, thank you. Thanks for making it to Wednesday afternoon at AIChE. I'm Chris. The work that I'm going to be talking about today was primarily done by Sid Rajaput, who was an excellent case undergrad that I worked with about a year ago. He's now a PhD student at UC Berkeley. And then somewhat, Aydin Rashidi, who's a PhD student, graduated from my group about a year ago, is now works at Sherwin-Williams. So in our group, one of the things we're interested in is total internal reflection microscopy, which is a measurement technique when you have a particle very near a boundary, separated some distance h from that boundary. As the particle fluctuates normal to the boundary, it'll scatter light with an intensity that depends exponentially on those fluctuations. From those fluctuations, you can then calculate the DLVO. You can calculate the colloidal interaction energy it has with that boundary. What I'm showing here is just a spherical particle that's primarily interacting through electrostatic repulsion and particle weight. So this is great. This is a technique. It's been developed over the last 3 decades or so. But we're really interested in anisotropic particles in our group because they're everywhere. Anisotropic particles, either non-spherical or non-uniform surface chemistries, appear in nature and in industry regularly. So more recently, we're getting interested in biological examples of this, like, for example, red blood cell adhesion in bacteria and things like that. But it turns out that TRM really can't be done with these types of particles if you hope to conduct a measurement, for example, with a red blood cell. So we're developing a technique called scattering morphology resolved TRM, which we hope will allow us to apply some of this experimental technique to anisotropic particles. In any case, I'm not talking exactly about that today. I'm talking about that next week at the virtual meeting in case you care. But this talk is somewhat about anisotropic particles. So one of the types of anisotropic particles that we're interested in our lab are called Janus particles, and there's lots of ways you can make Janus particles. We saw in the plenary yesterday beautiful work on metal cap Janus particles, but you can also make polymer composite Janus particles and even nanosheets that are made Janus. We focus mostly on these, where you have some native particle and a metal source that's evaporated onto that particle. And the metal can be platinum, gold, titanium, whatever you'd like. We usually make it either gold or platinum. And for the video that I showed at the beginning, those active particles, those are platinum-capped Janus particles. They're in hydrogen peroxide, and they swim as a consequence of diffuse geophoresis, again, as we saw in the plenaries yesterday. But really, the point of the rest of my talk is really to walk you through how we calculate the DLVO energy for this particular type of anisotropic particle, Janus particle. And this really started because we wanted to understand the TRM experiment itself. So we wanted to basically be able to calculate these fluctuations in position and orientation and do it for like different quantities of data, different time steps, et cetera. To be able to control or be able to basically optimize the way we do the experiment. So we started out by doing Brownian dynamics. That was really primarily Aydin's work. The way we do it is we use a pretty traditional stepping algorithm where you can step through heights or orientations, taking into account the conservative forces, which are given in red F, the hydrodynamic forces, and then also these random displacements in position. This is the stepping algorithm for position, but then you can also run a stepping algorithm for orientation that has the same structure. And again, you can take into account torques as a consequence of conservative forces that depend on orientation. And then also hydrodynamics of these fluctuations in orientation as a consequence of the particle being near the boundary. So if you run these stepping algorithms, then you get raw data that looks like this. So on the primary y is theta, on the primary x is height, and then on yeah, that's right. And then on the secondary X is time. So these are 3D, these are fluctuations in position and orientation, but then like TRM, we want to be able to utilize these fluctuations in position and orientation to calculate the potential energy profile, that thing I showed you on the first slide. You do that by assuming the particle samples of Boltzmann distribution of heights. So basically, or orientational positions. So you basically assemble probability distributions and then invert those and get the potential energy. So some of the data that I'm going to be showing in the next couple of slides are basically probability distributions. One of the things that we're really interested in, and I'm going to comment a lot more on at the end of the talk, is the influence of non-matching cap density. So these particles, they're typically polymer or silica particles, and the metal is far denser than those materials. And one of the questions in our community was whether or not the presence of this heavy cap will tend to quench these orientational fluctuations at experimentally relevant conditions. So what I'm showing here are observations as a function of orientation, and you can see at these experimentally relevant conditions between 1 and 6 microns in size of the particle, with a gold cap of 20 nanometers, which is very typical, you do actually get strong orientational quenching of the Janus particle. And then we can do things like vary particle size, and we saw again that the particle size really does drastically affect this orientational quenching. 1 micron polystyrene particle, you probably don't see much quenching, right? There's no peak in this probability distribution. But at 6 microns, you get very strong quenching. So this means basically like the particle would be, not stuck necessarily, but would more likely sample orientations with the cap down. So then we can take those probabilities. For this particular case, we assume that the probability of the height and orientational fluctuations are independent and calculate the potential energy. And this is what the potential energy profiles look like for 3 and 6 micron particles, okay? But that's actually not really the big piece of what I want to communicate today. That was kind of old work at this point. We did this, like I said, to kind of think, more deeply about the experiment that we do in our lab. But what would be probably more useful for the community is to develop an analytical expression for this potential energy landscape. Because again, remember, we're feeding in the dynamics, we're pulling out position and orientation, then we're calculating potential energy landscape. You can just go straight to potential energy landscape most of the time, right? So that was our goal, but that's kind of complicated. So we used a technique called SEI, surface element integration, which was developed about 25 years ago. You could think of it as kind of like a de Roggen approximation, where you take infinitesimally small slabs that are normal to the surface, and you integrate across that surface in order to obtain the potential energy associated with that particular contribution. So you can do that for any arbitrary shape, which is great because, as I'll describe to you, these caps are not perfect caps. They have funky shapes. So we did that, and you use the SEI method for the two forces that are surface forces, the van der Waals force and the electric double layer force. Gravity is just a body force. You don't necessarily need that. Yeah. So I mentioned this thing about the caps. So we did some experiments a couple years ago where we made the Janus particles, and then we cut the Janus particle in half, and we measured the cap thickness as a function of the angle from the center. And so the assumption usually is that the cap thickness is perfect, or is constant all the way around, so like 20 nanometers, for example. But indeed, it's not, as you would expect, because you're evaporating this material onto the contour of the particle. you would expect at the equator you would have, a thickness that decays to 0, and at the top you would have nominally what you would have predicted. So we measured this, and that is true. So what we did was we utilized this SEI method and a model for the thickness of the cap that varied with angle from the center in order to take this into account to determine if it's really something that is relevant. So this just quickly is all the relevant geometry parameters. It's kind of complicated to see, especially on this screen. But if you want to look, you can look at the PRE. Okay, so we start by looking at the base case, which is the heavy cap with uniform thickness. So this is the potential energy landscape. On the y-axis is the orientation, where at the top the cap is up, at the bottom the cap is down. And then on the axis, separation distance. If you there's a lot going on here. So if you draw a line across, you can kind of imagine these blue regions being the secondary minimum and the primary minimum. And then as you go from not just a cut across, but then different regions within this contour, you can think about, okay, at the very short separation distances, at this type of orientation, I'll have very strong van der Waals attraction because the zeta potential of the gold is very small compared to the native particle. So in that regime, the van der Waals attraction is great, and then is greater than EDL. Whereas up here, you'll be EDL dominated, electric double layer dominated, and then up at larger separation distance, you'll be weight dominated because these first two things are irrelevant when you're a micron away from the boundary. So we did that for this uniform coating. And we were curious, again, like I said, about the impact of non-uniformity here. And what I'm showing here are side-by-side potential energy landscapes for uniform and non-uniform coating. You can see that there's differences. Again, this is at experimentally relevant conditions. But the key feature that you should take from this is that there's more restrictive quenching in the secondary minimum with the non-uniform cap, which means that the secondary minimum is somewhat smaller than in the uniform coating case, but it's less restrictive. It's less restrictively orientationally quenched out of the secondary minimum, and that's primarily because of the cap weight. Because if you have a non-uniform coating where the maximum thickness is identical, then you can just logically recognize that you would have less mass of the cap in the non-uniform case because you need to decay the thickness down to 0. And just to finish up here, you can unpack the landscape a little bit more effectively, I would say, by separating out all the contributions. And I think this is probably maybe the most efficient way to communicate the effect. But I have here the 3 contributions: the electric double layer contribution, the van der Waals contribution, and the gravitational contribution. On the x-axis is orientation, and on the y is potential energy. So you should think about minimums or wells here as being locations where the particle would be quenched. So, and then the solid line is the non-uniform cap, and the dashed line is the uniform cap. So you can see that you really don't get any quenching contribution in the uniform cap case, but you do in the non-uniform cap case. And they're actually in somewhat different directions. In the van der Waals case, you get quenching in both situations, but the quenching is steeper in the uniform cap case. And then here, gravitational is kind of similar to the van der Waals, and you get quenching that again depends upon essentially the mass. And here we've done 2 cases where it's identical thickness at the top. So they have different masses, but this top line has a mass that matches the uniform cap case. So these all basically just kind of reveal that the cap contour, actually the shape of the cap that you've deposited is quite important. And if you were at the plant area yesterday, then you might have recognized too that, you know, these caps can be deposited in different shapes, different areas, which, you know, with this method you can apply, you can do that. So, all right. So really the two take-home messages are first that you can use these observations of position and orientation to get the potential energy landscape. That's somewhat old from our group at this point, but really the new thing is that it's this contour of the cap that's really relevant. And I want to thank you know, the group, collaborator Sepeda Razavi at Oklahoma, and funding. I can take any questions if there's time, although I don't know if there is. So thanks.